Today, 2nd September, we're now well into the fourth calendrical month of Ukraine's counteroffensive. On the 4th of September, that's to say on Monday, we can say that the Ukrainian offensive, so much talked about and spoken about for so many months, that offensive will have been ongoing for 3 months. And of course, in a few weeks' time, the autumn rains come, the Rasputitsa begins, and of course we also have issues about Ukraine's remaining reserves of men, ammunition, weapon systems, and the increasing difficulties that Ukraine is probably going to run into in sustaining its offensive from this point onwards. But let's review where we are at the moment, because again, there's been some little clarifications about the issues that have been taking place on the battlefronts, though overall my strong impression is that the situation in general is, relatively speaking, quite static. Now let's start with this village of 480 people, Rabotino, which Ukraine has been trying to capture since the 7th of June. Attacks on Rabotino began 3 days after the offensive started. On the 4th of June, the first attacks that took place in the offensive were in the Vremivka salient area, where Ukraine has managed to capture a few small villages, but has failed to make any significant progress. Well, Ukraine began its attack towards Rabotino from the nearby town of Orekhov, always under Ukrainian control, on the 7th of June. It's been trying to capture Rabotino ever since, or at least has been trying to do so until very recently. There's been multiple assaults, hundreds of armoured vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles have been destroyed in battles around Rabotino, in the minefields, and under the weight of Russian shelling, and large numbers of Ukrainian troops have died in these attacks on this one village, which, to reiterate again, before the war, is estimated to have had a population of around 480. And it's been pointed out that it's taken Ukraine longer to make any kind of progress towards Rabotino than it took the Russians to capture Mariupol in the fighting in the spring of 2022, spring and early summer of 2022. Mariupol, of course, being a city of 270,000 people. Rabotino, place which, as I said before the war, had a population of around 480 people. Now, I want to stress I don't personally place much weight on these comparisons. A place might have a small population, it might be strategically located, it might be heavily fortified. A city would be a different matter, might be more easy to capture. Right at the start of the war, the Russians basically marched into Kherson city unopposed. There were no Ukrainian defenses set up there, and most of the Ukrainian military had been redeployed to try to protect Kiev, where the Russians were located outside. But people have been making this point throughout the war. Whenever battles start in Bakhmut, in Mariupol, there's a lot of derision about the amount of time it's taken the Russians to capture these big places. Ukraine has struggled to capture Rabotino. It's been fighting to do it for the better part of 3 months. And even as of today, it hasn't been able to fully capture the place. Now, over the course of yesterday, there were a lot of reports about Rabotino. The first one, which I discussed in my program yesterday, was a rather strange report by Yevgeny Belitsky, who said that Ukraine had sent 2 companies of men to try to clear Rabotino, 200 men altogether, which is plausible. But then he gave what struck me as utterly fantastic numbers for the number of Ukrainian casualties. He said that 156 out of these 200 men that Ukraine had dispatched towards Rabotino had been either killed or wounded. So it did seem that there was a Ukrainian attack to try to consolidate control of Rabotino, but one which failed. I found the number of men that Belitsky said had been committed to this attack, around 200, plausible. It struck me that the casualty figures that he gave, 3/4 out of this entire force, was implausible. And it did make me wonder what was going on and whether the Russians weren't using these claims about massive Ukrainian casualties in this last attack on Rabotino to cover something. Well, a couple of hours later, a report appeared on Slavyangrad, which, as I said, I usually consider to be a reliable telegram channel. In fact, I find it one of the most reliable sources of news about the war, which said that the Russians had vacated the last 6 or so buildings that they control in the southern tip of Rabotino, so that there are no Russian troops now located within the village itself, but that they have taken positions, entrenched positions, built trenches just to the south of Rabotino, on the very tip of the village. And there's a map which shows how close these Russian defensive positions are to Rabotino itself. And this is apparently, or so Slavyangrad says, on slightly higher ground than Rabotino itself is. It dominates the village, and it means that Ukraine is unable to occupy the southern outskirts. And that seems to me a plausible explanation of what has happened. It's not clear to me whether there are in fact any Ukrainian troops in Rabotino itself. Probably the Ukrainians send troops in and out from time to time. In the northern and central areas, the southern ones, it looks like, are deserted, and it is now essentially a grey zone. And this is exactly the pattern that we've seen the Russians follow with other contested villages, with Pyatikhatki on the east bank of the Dnieper River in northern Kherson region, an area where Ukraine has mounted numerous attacks recently, but where it's failed to make progress. Pyatikhatki, largely deserted. Ukrainian troops have on occasion attempted to occupy it as they tried to press south. Whenever they do, they've been heavily shelled by the Russians. The village itself has been almost completely leveled. There's no cover there. Same pattern as we've seen now with Rabotino, and that means that the Ukrainians can't consolidate control of this village because there is no cover. And the Russians have done the same with 2 villages to the west in the Vremevka salient area, the villages of Staromayorsk and Urozhainoe, which have also been apparently largely leveled. The Russians remain in positions just outside these 2 villages, just as they remain in positions just outside Pyatikhatki. The Ukrainians might be able to send small groups of men into the northern and even central parts of these villages, but they can't consolidate control over them. And it seems to me that this is at least what the Russians are trying to do with Rabotino. And I'm going to repeat my view, which I expressed in my programs 2 days ago, which is that to all intents and purposes, the Battle of Rabotino for the moment is over, just as with Pyatikhatki, just as with Staromayorsk and Urozhainoe, The Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out, but they're unable to consolidate control, and the advance there has, to all intents and purposes, ended. And what has happened in this area, which perhaps we should call rather the Orekhov area, which is what the Russians call it, the Russian Defense Ministry has rarely referred to Rabotino itself in its various bulletins. It mainly talks about the Orekhov direction, Orekhov being the main town. Anyway, what has happened is that the Ukrainians instead have redirected their efforts towards another village located somewhere further to the east, a place called Verbovoye, and they've been trying to push towards Verbovoye, but it's clear that they haven't actually reached Verbovoye itself, and that the fighting is taking place some distance to the west of Verbovoye, in a narrow area, sort of apparently an area of lower ground, which, by the way, does approach the Surovikin line. And there's been an explanation of this situation, which I found on Slavyangrad, and which I have to say I found fairly useful. And it provides a map which shows where Ukraine has been trying to advance, the area where it's been trying to advance, and you can see a sort of narrow position, an arrow towards Verbovoye, which is some distance to the east, and this is all to the east of Rabotino itself, and you can see a shaded area of Rabotino, which is still in effect in the grey zone, dominated by the Russians themselves. And Slavyangrad has suggested that the purpose of these attacks, this advance towards Verbovoye, might be less to try to capture the village itself of Verbovoye, but to try to push the Russians to encircle Russian forces to the north of Verbovoye, and there are pictures of an area of Russian control to the north of Verbovoye, and the various villages and settlements there still occupied by the Russians. Now, I'm not the best person when it comes to reading maps, not by any possible means, but it does perhaps help here to look at another map which has been provided by Big Serge, and it gives us some idea of what Slavyangrad might be talking about, because we have here a map which shows the locations of the Surovikin line. The Surovikin line swings around Verbovoye. It's basically surrounded by the big fortifications to the Surovikin fortifications. But this area to the north of Verbovoye, which is still under Russian control, that area is to the north of the Surovikin line. And if you compare the two maps, the one provided by Big Serge and the one provided by Slavyangrad, you can see perhaps we can get a better idea of what the Ukrainians are trying to do. They're trying, in other words, to clear an area to the north of the Surovikin line and to the north of Verbovoye, with who knows precisely what intention. And Slavyangrad also made a point that there is no Ukrainian attempt to advance south of Rabotino towards the larger village or small town of Novoprokopivka, which is the place, again to the north of the Surovikin line, which one would presume that the Ukrainians would need to capture if they were to try to advance further south towards Tokmak. And then again, Big Serge has more maps which show that there are more Russian fortified lines south of Novoprokopivka, and by the way, south of Verbovoye as well. It gives an interesting picture of the sort of very heavily layered fortifications that the Russians have created in this area. Big Serge made the point that the Russian fortifications in this particular area are some of the densest in any part of the Surovikin line, illustrating perhaps the importance of this area both to the Ukrainians and to the Russians. So I think this is perhaps a clearer picture of what's happening. Now, there were lots of reports about these Ukrainian attacks to the area to the west of Verbovoye, this narrow advance that the Ukrainians are conducting. Going back to Balitsky, he talks about this taking place through a gully, and for all I know it might very well be correct. It might be that there's high ground on either side. Anyway, the point is that it does seem as if most of the advances in this area are taking place on foot. The Ukrainian troops are trying to advance in this area on foot. They're presumably minefields. The Russian artillery is again well positioned to fire on Ukrainian troops trying to advance through this narrow area, and it's perhaps understandable, therefore, why the Ukrainians would want to advance on foot. Armoured vehicles would probably not survive for very long, but of course the losses that Ukraine is going to be suffering, the human losses, are inevitably going to be extremely high. Now, I think that all of this provides some explanation for some of the reports that have been appearing in the media in the West, and which have been coming increasingly, by the way, from the White House, which is that we're seeing this narrow advance towards Verbovoye, to the outlying positions of the Surovikin line here, and you could argue that this is an attempt to, when they use the word pierce, it does suggest a narrow advance. Always with Western commentaries, it's debatable. They're never completely clear what they mean when they talk about the first line of Russian defenses. It is certainly true that the Ukrainians have pushed more deeply into the original positions that the Russians had held north of the Surovikin line. And it's also true that there were Russian defense positions there, that the Russians had built trenches and other fortified posts in this area. But if we're talking about the heavy, big, densely layered defences, I don't think one can talk about them having been breached or pierced, despite the fact that there continue to be attempts to claim that in the Wall Street Journal today. Now, I've noticed that there's been another daily bulletin today in The Guardian, and not from The Guardian, I'm reading it from The Guardian, but from the British Ministry of Defence, and it's actually quite an interesting report because it says that Ukrainian forces continue to take offensive action on the Orihov axis in southern Ukraine, with units reaching the first Russian main defensive line. Now notice the word reach. It's not the same as suggesting that there's been any sort of breakthrough. And the report goes on to say that Russian armed forces, primarily composed of the 58th Combined Arms Army and Russian airborne forces, seek to halt the Ukrainian counteroffensive whilst maintaining their own offensive on the northern axis around Kupiansk. And then it talks about the fact that the Russians are at risk of dividing their forces if they continue their offensive towards Kupiansk, while simultaneously defending in the Orekhov area. Now that, by the way, it seems to me is certainly wrong. The forces that are conducting the offensive in Kupiansk, which we will come to shortly, are entirely different, or have been different, from the forces that the Russians have deployed in the Orekhov area. It's simply not the case that these two groupings that the Russians have, that the Russians are shuffling troops in large numbers between one or the other, or are dividing their forces in that kind of way. But note again that the British Ministry of Defence talks about Ukrainian forces reaching the first Russian main defence line. They appear to accept, in other words, that the Ukrainians have not actually, despite claims to the contrary, broken through. The original reports about a breach of the Surovikin line, or at least a breach of the first Russian defence lines, came from the United States. General Milley, in fact, about 10 days ago, they referred to the Russian defence lines in Rabotino itself, which is, of course, not the defence lines in the Surovikin line, the big main defensive line, which is, as I said, to the south, well to the south of Rabotino. And as I said, it's clear that there's a certain amount of, shall we say, discussion or storytelling about where the main Russian defensive lines are. It's probably true that near Verbovoye, well, it is, I think, certainly true that near Verbovoye, the Ukrainians have now reached them, and that this is the area where they're attacking. But but so far, at least, there's been no breakthrough. And the Russian reports, by the way, continue to speak of very heavy losses in this area. Now, all of this might give the impression that this is where the heaviest fighting has actually been, that it's been in the Orekhov area. And the Russian Ministry of Defense provided an update about the fighting over the week from 25th August to 1st September in its yesterday as part of its latest bulletin, its latest update about the state of the battle. And it's an extremely interesting update. I mentioned, I think, again, in a program I did a few days ago, that I noticed that the Russians had not been providing much information about Ukrainian losses in the Orekhov or indeed any other area. And I said that I thought that the Russians were probably adding up Ukrainian losses and would provide an overview. And in fact, that's exactly what they've done. But it is a very interesting overview, even more interesting than the one I'd expected. And I'm going to read it in full because it gives us such an interesting idea of where, according to the Russians, the main fighting is taking place. And first of all, it begins from 25th August to 1st September. The Russian forces launched five groups of long-range naval and airborne high-precision strikes at Ukrainian command posts, radio electronic centres, port infrastructure, ammunition, and Western weaponry depots, as well as military airfields, all of which no doubt is correct. And then it discusses the effectiveness of these strikes. But then it goes on to say, over the past week, the combat environment was the most tense and complicated in Donetsk and Zaporozhye directions. In Zaporozhye direction, the armed forces of Ukraine attempted to launch 44 attacks at positions of the Russian armed forces to no avail. Now, let me stress, what they're referring to here is, beyond any reasonable doubt, the Zaporozhye, the Orekhov and Vremevka salient directions. So when they say that there's been 44 attacks, they mean 44 attacks towards Rabotino, towards Verbovoye, and in the Vremevka salient area. And the report then goes on to say, to reinforce efforts to break through Russian forces' defences, one of the last formations of the Ukrainian Strategic Reserve, namely the 71st Jaeger Brigade, is deployed in this direction. Now, I think that is being deployed to the Vremevka salient. And then it goes on to say, as a result of committed and competent actions of the Zaporozhye group of forces, this is the Russian army, all Ukrainian attacks have been successfully repelled. Over the past week, more than 960 Ukrainian troops, 24 armoured fighting vehicles of different modifications, 28 motor vehicles and 45 field artillery units have been neutralised. Severe Ukrainian manpower losses in the course of the so-called counteroffensive are caused by Russian forces' effective strikes at Ukrainian armoured hardware at distant approaches. The Ukrainian Formation Command purposely throws manpower in assaults to cross Russian forces' minefields on foot with no fire support. So what they're saying is that the Ukrainians in this area, and they're specifically, I think, talking more here about the Orekhov area, are trying to advance on foot because their armour can't come close because the Russian artillery destroys the armour and the armour gets burnt in the minefields. And the result is, according to the Russians, that 960 Ukrainian troops have been neutralised. Now, I want to stress again, these are Russian figures, and of course we have no external corroboration for them. But to repeat again, when the Russians talk about 960 Ukrainian troops being neutralised, they don't mean killed, they mean killed and wounded. And I want to clarify that because, again, this is an area where there's been a great deal of misunderstanding. But anyway, then the Russian Defense Ministry hones in on fighting not so much just in the Vremevka salient area, but in the main area of the Ukrainian push, which is in the Staromayorsk area, near the village of Staromayorsk and Orozhanoye. And it says in the southern Donetsk area, Staromayorsk is in southern Donetsk, the most intensive battles took place south of Staromayorsk. Professional command and control, cohesive actions of the Russian troops with support of aviation and artillery thwarted the Ukraine's offensive plans. Combined strikes and committed actions of the Vostok group of forces repelled all Ukrainian attacks. Over the past week, Ukraine suffered losses of up to 1,025 Ukrainian troops, 13 armoured fighting vehicles, 26 motor vehicles, as well as 26 field artillery pieces. Now, again, they're talking about 1,025 Ukrainian troops having been neutralised in this area, lost by Ukraine in this area. Let me repeat again, these are Russian figures. I'm not vouching as to their accuracy. And repeat again, Russians are talking about lost and wounded. But note this, more Ukrainian troops appear to have been lost, according to the Russians, 1,025 in the attacks in this area of the Vremivka salient, as opposed to the 960 that have been lost on the Zaporozhye front, primarily in the area of Orekhov, Rabotino, and the rest. And then the Russian Defense Ministry discusses fighting that's taking place on the third axis of Ukraine's offensive, which is in Bakhmut. And it says this: in the Donetsk direction, numerous attempts of the Ukrainian Solidar group of troops to break through Russian forces near Kleshevka and Malo-Ilinovka have been foiled. During the week, this is again from 25th August until 1st September, Russian forces repelled 36 attacks in which Ukraine lost up to 2,385 Ukrainian troops, 30 tanks and other armoured fighting vehicles, 75 motor vehicles, and 21 field artillery guns. So, in the Bakhmut area, because this is what this is referring to, again the Russians are claiming Ukraine lost 2,385 men, dead and wounded. Again, I'm not vouching for the accuracy of this figure, but note once more that this is higher than the Russians are claiming Ukraine lost in the fighting in the Vremivka salient, which was 1,025, and it is much higher than the total number of Ukrainian troops lost in the fighting in Zaporozhye, primarily the Orekhov area, over the course of that week, which is 960. In fact, Ukraine, according to the Russians, lost more troops in the Bakhmut area over the course of the week leading up to the 1st of September in the Bakhmut area than it lost in the Vremivka salient area and in the Orekhov area combined. The heaviest fighting, in other words, according to the Russians, has not been around Rabotino or in the Vremivka salient. It's not been on the southern front lines. It's been on the eastern front lines, where Ukraine has been trying to attack towards Bakhmut, the former Bakhmut, trying to capture this village of Kleshevka, and where the Ukrainians have suffered, according to the Russians, much heavier losses than on the two other axes of advance combined. Now, let me reiterate again, I am not vouching for the accuracy of these Russian figures, the precise accuracy of these Russian figures. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, in a meeting some weeks ago, told Putin that the Russians get their information about Ukrainian losses from Ukrainian radio intercepts. And it may be that these figures are correct. There is some reason to think that they are probably roughly so. But whether or not the figures themselves are accurate in their exact number, I suggest that they do give an overall sense of where the battle, of where the fighting has been fiercest. All of the focus of attention in the media, in the West, in my programs, in other places, has been on what's been going on in this little village of Rabotino, in the fighting around Verbovoye. But actually, Ukraine has lost, according to the Russians, more men in the Verbovoye salient and many more men, almost, well, 3 times as many in the fighting in and around Bakhmut. The Bakhmut meat grinder, if one can use that expression, is still operating. One can perhaps understand why Western commanders, Western senior officers, have been getting increasingly frustrated about this and have been trying to get the Ukrainians to change course and to commit less of their forces to this battle in Bakhmut and to focus more instead on what's going on in the southern front lines. And that does make one wonder about what Ukraine's actual priorities in this battle are. Do they perhaps realize that Tokmak, Melitopol, the Sea of Azov are completely beyond their reach? Are they conducting this offensive in the south because they have to, because the West insists upon it? But is it the case that their heart continues to be in this battle in Bakhmut, which perhaps, whether rightly or wrongly, they continue to feel is the more important, and from their point of view, more dangerous axis? The Russians have also provided, by the way, indications about Ukrainian losses in the Kupiansk and Liman fighting. And this is what they say. In the Kupiansk direction, the Zapad, that's the West group of forces, that's the Russian military, improved tactical situation by seizing enemy strongholds and key heights. Ukrainian troops suffered heavy damage due to the skillful use of weapons. Over the past week, the enemy has suffered losses of up to 470 Ukrainian troops, 22 armoured fighting vehicles, 21 motor vehicles, as well as 18 field artillery units. 470 men killed or wounded on the Ukrainian side near Kupiansk. Less than half the number killed in the fighting south of Orekhov, and less than a quarter the number killed in the fighting in the Bakhmut area. So lots of discussion about the Kupiansk offensive, but the fighting there clearly has been significantly less intense. And in the Liman area, which is to the south of Kupiansk, the Russians say that the center group of forces repelled 14 Ukrainian attacks over the past week. Ukraine has suffered losses of up to 540 Ukrainian troops, 22 armoured fighting vehicles, 13 motor vehicles, 10 field artillery pieces. So we can see that fighting around Liman, according to the Russians, these figures from the Russians, more intense than the fighting around Kupiansk itself. And again, this gives us a very interesting overview about the real nature of the battle and of the fighting. So, another week of very heavy Ukrainian losses, but I think if you add them all up, you will probably find that around 40% of them have been lost in one small area of the fighting, which is in and around Bakhmut. Now, of course, the Russians do not give us details of their own losses. They've not done so in this particular bulletin. They scarcely ever do. Every so often we do get reports from the Russians that do provide us with some information about losses, but they don't provide us with the losses. And I'm not going to use this bulletin as a springboard to try to calculate losses on either side. I'm simply saying that it's interesting in that it perhaps does give us a sense of where the fighting has been more intense, and it's not the same place that you might expect from the headlines. Anyway, let's move on. Lots of other things have been happening in the war. First and foremost, we've had more Ukrainian attempts to launch attacks on the Kerch bridge. This is what the Russians tell us, that there were 3 seaborne drones, these waterborne drones, heading towards the Kerch bridge. All of them were detected by the Russians this time. The Russians have learnt about how these drones can strike the Kerch bridge. The Russians have been putting barges and other things around the Kerch bridge to try to harden its defences from Ukrainian attacks. And on this occasion, the Russians anyway were able to detect these drones, and all 3 of them were destroyed. It's a sign that Ukraine hasn't given up its attempts to attack the Kerch bridge. And according to the Russians, over the last week, there have been more attacks by Ukraine on various Russian positions. The same Russian military bulletin that, as I said, have described the fighting has given us some idea of what the Ukrainians have attempted in terms of drone and air strikes across Russia and missile strikes across Russia and upon Russian positions over the last week or so. It says that on the 29th to 30th August, the Black Sea naval aircraft managed to foil a Ukrainian Special Forces detachment's attempts to land on the Crimean coast. Russian naval aircraft neutralized 4 boats and up to 50 Ukrainian soldiers. I've already discussed this James Bond operation, which has achieved nothing. And it then says that air defense and electronic warfare systems have downed 35 HIMARS missiles, 6 JDAM guided bombs, 5 US-made HARM anti-radiation missiles. These are intended to knock out Russian radars, as well as 1 Neptune anti-ship cruise missile and 1 S-200 missile converted into a strike version over the past week. 281 unmanned aerial vehicles, these are drones, including a Tupolev 141 Strij drone, as well as 29 fixed wing drones, were shot down in western regions of the Russian Federation. So we see that Ukraine is again trying to launch a Strij drone. It's the first indication we've heard about this for some time. These are these converted Russian Soviet-era surveillance drones. Ukraine has converted them into cruise missiles. They launched 1 such cruise missile towards some undisclosed Russian location, but it failed to get through. And Ukraine has launched a major offensive with drones over the previous week, the week leading up to the attacks yesterday, and the Russians say that they've managed to bring down 281 of these drones in these attacks that have been launched towards Russia. Now, they don't mention, of course, the one place where one can say that the Ukrainians have achieved some success, which is in the air attack, the Ukrainian drone attack on the airbase in Pskov. And we've now got satellite photos of the Pskov airfield, and they show two Ilyushin 76 transport aircraft destroyed and two other Ilyushin 76 aircraft which have experienced a limited amount of damage and which are capable of repair. So it was, by most measures, a successful attack. Though, as I've discussed in my previous programs, in some respects a pointless one, because these are not aircraft that are participating in any way in the war in Ukraine, the war that has been fought between Russia and Ukraine. And the most interesting thing about the commentaries that I've been hearing from Ukraine is that the Ukrainians are now dropping very heavy hints that these drone attacks, this drone attack on Pskov was launched by a sabotage group, either Russians, dissident Russians, or Ukrainians from Russian territory. This may be true, may not be true. I've no way of knowing. I think that the Russians will take this report very seriously. And besides, they're probably going to, over time, harden their defences even further. The key thing to understand, and this is what these overall figures from the Russian Defence Ministry tell us, is that this drone offensive that Ukraine has launched, which, by the way, I've noticed, seems to have died down over the last couple of hours, that it has not achieved anything of any real significance. So this Russian report gives us some sense of the overall fighting. There's been this Ukrainian push east of Rabotino. Ukraine has suffered significant losses. The Russian Defense Ministry confirms Russian war reporters who say that the Ukrainians now are attacking on foot. But in fact, the real heavy fighting continues to be around Bakhmut, not so much on the southern front lines, and for the moment at least, no sign of any actual Ukrainian breakthrough on the southern front lines, or indeed anywhere else, despite some claims that we've seen in the media. And for the moment, the battle is frozen. The same, by the way, is true of the Russian advances. Now, I talked about Kupiansk in many programs. It's clear to me that the Russian advance on Kupiansk has been brought to a stop. And I don't think that this is the result of intense fighting or of intense Ukrainian resistance. We saw from that Russian report that the Russians claim a significantly lower total for Ukrainian losses in the Kupiansk area than they're reporting in other places. And I think the explanation is that, for the moment at least, the Russians have achieved their initial objectives. They brought their troops very close to Kupiansk. They've captured lots of settlements in Kupiansk. They're now probably waiting for Ukraine to deplete its last reserves in its offensive to the south, even as they prepare for their own offensive, which is to come. In some ways, this again reminds me of what happened last summer in the fighting around Bakhmut. The Russians made significant advances towards Bakhmut at the end of June and in July of last year, and then the battle for Bakhmut went quiet for several months until the Russians took a decision to restart it in earnest in November. And then we had the intense fighting around Bakhmut launched by the Wagner organization, which ultimately culminated in the capture of Bakhmut in May. So it seems to me that once again the Russians have brought their forces close to Kupiansk. They've taken some of the important positions around it. They've embedded themselves there, and they're now positioned for a further advance when they choose to undertake it. When that will be, I'm no idea. I'm not going to try and guess. I think, by the way, that the guess by the British Defence Ministry that this is intended to divert Ukrainian troops from the southern front lines almost certainly is wrong. I think the purpose of the Russians is to improve their position around Kupiansk and in the north before further advances, and in the meantime, again, the Russians are focusing instead on grinding down Ukrainian forces and reserves in the south, in Zaporozhye, around Bakhmut, in all of these other places. Anyway, that's my summary of the situation on the battlefields as of today. I would say that there was another big Russian missile and drone attack across Ukraine. These have become now so routine that it's almost become uninteresting to talk about them. Though, of course, each one of these missile and drone attacks, these tend to have been focused, as far as I can understand, on striking Ukrainian ammunition dumps and logistics centres, with a particular heavy strike towards the Ukrainian town of Kryvyi Rog, which is on the Dnieper River, on the west bank of the Dnieper River. Anyway, I suspect that these big strikes, which the Russians have launched, are again preparatory for something else. And by the way, there's now been reports that the Ukrainians are becoming worried that the Russians, even as they launch more of these missile and drone attacks, are busy stockpiling large numbers of cruise missiles and drones in preparation for their big offensive, which is to come. Who's to say? Anyway, that's where we are for the moment on the battlefronts. There's been some interesting comments by some Ukrainian reporters. There's been a Ukrainian reporter who's recently been on the front line. She's talked again about faltering morale amongst Ukrainian troops, about the Russians having dominance in terms of drones and of heavily outgunning Ukraine in terms of artillery. It's a story we've heard before. There's been some very interesting comments by Kirilo Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief. He makes his usual claims about, Ukraine being on course to victory, but if you drill below the surface, there's actually some discordant notes in his latest comments. He accepts, for example, that Ukraine is suffering very heavy casualties, though he's not telling us how heavy those casualties actually are. And he also admits that Ukraine is now utterly, completely dependent on the support of the West. It could not sustain the war for more than a month, according to him, if that Western support were withdrawn, though he hastens to say that he has no reason to think that it will be withdrawn at any point soon. He may be right about this. There was a report, I think, in the Washington Post, which said that at the moment, within the higher reaches of the administration in Washington, the Biden administration, all talk of negotiations with the Russians has become taboo. Something which strongly suggests to me that President Biden, who I have always felt is a consistent hardliner in terms of this conflict, that he has basically made it clear to everybody in the higher reaches of the administration, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, all of the others, that he is not interested in negotiations, that this isn't what he wants. His intention is instead to brazen this out. There's apparently some reports that in Germany, where the economic situation is deteriorating, there's some indications it's starting to sag in the United States as well. But anyway, that's for another day to discuss. But anyway, there's some reports that within the German government, there is now more discussion about the need for some kind of diplomatic outreach to the Russians. But the consistent story up to this point in this conflict is that the current German government always follows the US lead, and unless the US is prepared to push forward with negotiations, I can't really see Germany doing it by itself. So it seems to me that President Biden currently is trying to shut all talk of negotiations down, and it's likely that he's succeeding in doing that. There's also now accumulated reports that the president himself, President Biden, and the officials around him, that their major concern at the moment is not Ukraine. They don't want to negotiate about Ukraine. On the contrary, at the moment all the talk is again about some degree of escalation. They can't send F-16s. The Pentagon has put its foot down, doesn't want to send ATACMS missiles. But apparently the US Abrams tanks are now going to be equipped with depleted uranium shells, the ones that have been sent to Ukraine. There was huge uproar in Russia when the British said that they were going to supply depleted uranium shells for the Challenger 2s that Britain had supplied. The Russians have this time shaken their heads, if you like, over the American deliveries of depleted uranium shells for the 30 Abrams tanks that the United States is supplying to Ukraine. I think the Russians have come to understand that this is going to happen, whatever they do. But anyway, the administration seems to be focused on taking this fateful step. I would add in parenthesis that I suspect that one of the reasons why we've not seen the Challenger 2s operating on the battlefields is that the Russians did find out where the 120mm rifled rounds supplied by Britain for the Challenger 2's guns were located, and probably bombed the ammunition dump. It might have been the place in Khmelnytsky that people were speculating about some months ago. Who knows? But anyway, I think the Russians just understand that the United States is going to provide these rounds and that there isn't going to be any pushback in the West, and they'll just have to deal with these rounds when they appear. But anyway, going back to the administration, it's clear to me that President Biden's focus now is defeating the Republican moves to impeach him, which he now believes, I'm sure he now believes, are inevitable, that are going to start getting underway in October. And there are reports that a formidable legal team is being assembled and that it will be an aggressive defense of President Biden's actions when the impeachment process starts rolling in the autumn. And I suspect that quite apart from President Biden's own feelings about Ukraine and about the war, he doesn't want to show weakness to his Republican opponents at this time by countenancing negotiations with the Russians. And that's one other reason why he's taking a harder line about negotiations at this point. He probably calculates also that if he does open negotiations with the Russians, some Republican senators, people like Mitt Romney, Lindsey Graham, who he might be trying to split away from the Republican grouping that might be prepared to support impeachment, that these Republican senators, very hard line about Russia that they always are, that they might not be happy about negotiations and are less likely to support him in an impeachment process. So I suspect impeachment is now going to be the main dominant issue in the United States over the next few weeks. Ukraine is going to be relegated to lesser importance. There will be dribbles of American weapons still heading towards Ukraine. But the key takeaway is that with the president under pressure, he doesn't want to be seen to give ground on any issue, and certainly not on the issue of Ukraine. And probably the president himself, President Biden, and his team, they're probably saying to themselves that Mitch McConnell's apparent problems, his health problems, the fact that he's been freezing in the middle of speeches and comments, they probably relied on McConnell to some extent to try to slow down any impeachment process in the Senate. They may be calculating that if they can't rely on him, well, if he's not there, that might make this impeachment process rather more aggressive in the way it's pursued by the Republicans, and that's going to make the administration take an even harder line. Obviously, in strategizing about impeachment, I'm discussing territory that I'm not so familiar with. This is a topic which no doubt we will be having a program about, a live stream about on the Duran at the right time with Robert Barnes, and we can talk about it more fully there. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. The last point that I'm going to discuss is that there's now considerable dismay in the West about the fact that Xi Jinping is not turning up to the G20 summit meeting in Delhi. And there's been an interesting article about all of this in the Financial Times. Of all the media outlets in Europe, I've always felt that the Financial Times is the one that is closest to the administration itself. Its title is Xi Jinping's absence challenges G20 status as global leadership forum. And there's a long piece about how the article goes on about how China is now refocusing on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and even more on BRICS, as opposed to the G20, that the G20 is starting to lose relevance, which is true, by the way. It also mentions that there have been months of failed efforts by G20's multiple ministerial forums to find joint conclusions on topics running from healthcare to climate change because of disagreements over the war in Ukraine and burden sharing between rich and developing nations, which is interesting. So there's splits between the Western powers and the global South, and I've heard that there hasn't been a single joint statement agreed so far, that the Indians are becoming increasingly frustrated. The Indian chair is becoming increasingly frustrated by Western insistence, the West's insistence on every statement having to follow Western positions, be it on economic aid to the global South, or of course Ukraine. There have previously been articles about this very topic by M.K. Badrakumar on his indispensable blog, which is Indian Punchline. Anyway, I understand the Indian hosts have been increasingly frustrated about this lack of progress. But it's fascinating that the commentators on the Financial Times don't seem to grasp that if Xi Jinping has decided that it's not worth his while attending the G20, that it's not just him throwing some kind of hissy fit. It's because this lack of progress is happening because of the intransigence of the Western powers on every single issue. That it's made the Chinese decide that there's really no point in engaging with the Western powers within the G20 format, because the Western powers are simply not, as the Russians like to say, agreement capable on any significant issue. And it's interesting to see how there's complaints. The article tries to say that it's China that has been blocking agreement on almost all issues, which in fact, as I said, it's Western governments don't seem to understand that the Chinese have their point of view, and it's a point of view that is supported by many countries around the world, a fact which the BRICS summit, in which so many countries, so many non-Western countries attended and participated in, it made that fact clear. Anyway, the other thing that the Financial Times article fails to mention or won't mention is the fact that undoubtedly a key reason why President Xi Jinping has apparently decided to stay away is that he doesn't want to meet President Biden of the United States. There's been a string of US officials going to Beijing. There's been Blinken, there's been Yellen, Commerce Secretary Raimondo has also just been to Beijing, had meetings and discussions with Chinese officials. There have been somewhat plaintive articles appearing in the US media. When will the Chinese send their officials to Washington? They're showing no sign or interest in doing so because the Chinese have come to understand that the US is simply trying to string them along. It's trying to create an appearance of normality in relations between China and the United States, even whilst the United States simultaneously takes more aggressive steps towards China, restricting exports of advanced technology, of chips and other advanced technology, pushing, taking more stronger military positions in the Pacific region. There's even been a somewhat extraordinary event discussed by the Moon of Alabama and other places, where an Indonesian delegation was hosted in the Pentagon. The Pentagon then released a joint statement, supposedly agreed by the US Department of Defense and the Indonesians, which could be construed as taking a US pro-US position on the conflict with China. And the Chinese said, hold on, this is not what the Indonesians agreed to. And the Indonesians said as much. They said that they never actually agreed to this joint statement. And it seems that the United States has been forced to basically pull back a bit on this statement. They've had to accept that it wasn't actually a joint statement that the Indonesians had agreed to at all. So, given all this is taking place, it's not surprising that President Xi does not want to meet with President Biden in any format, and certainly doesn't want to be manoeuvred into a meeting at the G20, which US officials and the US media and the media in Europe will try to claim shows that there is some kind of normalization of relations between China and the United States. No such normalization is taking place. In addition, and beyond that, there is another factor not often discussed in the media in the West, but it's clear to me that President Xi and President Biden don't get on very well. To reiterate a point I've made in several programs and in several venues, in one Chinese readout of a virtual summit between Xi Jinping and President Biden, Xi Jinping actually complained directly to President Biden that President Biden says one thing whenever they meet, this on the topic of Taiwan, and then after the meeting, the opposite happens. And given that this is so, it's perhaps unsurprising that President Xi doesn't want to have a meeting with a political leader he doesn't particularly like or particularly trust. And the same, by the way, is true of President Biden. He clearly doesn't get on with President Xi. He made some extraordinary statements about President Xi in unprompted comments he made over the course of his State of the Union address, and he was spectacularly rude about President Xi, calling him a dictator and such, and saying that he was paranoid and all that kind of thing, in a discussion with donors, Democratic Party donors, following the Blinken visit to Beijing, in comments that actually appeared on the White House website in a way that, as I've discussed before, could only have happened with the particular wish of President Biden himself. So the overall conclusion is that US-China relations are deteriorating. The Chinese are working now to build up the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They've lost much faith in the G20. They don't want to be maneuvered into what could be called a summit meeting with Biden in Delhi, and that is why they're staying away. And I'm going to suggest that almost certainly President Xi warned Prime Minister Modi of India that this was likely to happen during their meeting in Johannesburg a few weeks ago at the time of the BRICS summit. So, there we are. A Cold War getting colder in the Pacific, a frozen war for the moment in Ukraine, but a war where, as I said, the equilibrium is becoming more unstable. Ukraine suffering very heavy losses on the battlefront. The Russians building up their forces, piling up missile forces, all of those things. And more reports, more and more rumours of a Ukrainian mobilization, which, to be very clear, is not a sign of strength or a sign of confidence, but a sign that things are going badly wrong. Anyway, That's my programme for today. More from me soon. Just to repeat again, you can find us on all our various platforms, especially Locals and Rumble. Remember, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. You can also check out our shop and buy yourself the great things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.